My boyfriend of 7 years cheated on me. Came clean about his affair with a coworker. 7 years of building memories. Sharing secrets. Celebrating our little wins. Picking each other up when things got rough. We had history. A life we built from scratch. Just him and me. I was so secure in us. So sure that I'd picked the right person to weather life with. He wasn't just my boyfriend. He was my best friend. We knew each other inside and out. And he had this way of making me feel like I was everything he ever wanted. Like he looked at me and thought, yeah, that's it. That's my person. He didn't just tell me he loved me. He showed it in a million small ways. Every single day. And it felt genuine. It felt like it was coming from a place of truth. Like I'd found someone who truly understood how to love another person. For as long as I can remember, people around us talked about how we were, endgame. That couple who everyone thought would be together forever. And we were a solid team. Or so I thought. We didn't have one of those relationships where you feel like you're constantly walking on eggshells. Wondering if the next fight would be the end. No, we'd argue sometimes, sure, but there was never that lingering fear that things would fall apart. We were good, steady, we had each other's backs. And that gave me so much security. You know, it's rare to find someone who just gets you. Flaws and all. The best part was how well we balanced each other out. I'm kind of the more serious, organized type, always trying to plan for the future, making sure things are on track, and he was the easygoing one. Able to calm me down when I'd start spiraling about life. He made me laugh when I needed it, grounded me when I was overwhelmed, and it felt like we just fit. Like the two of us could handle anything as long as we were together. Our families loved us together. My parents would always say how lucky I was to have him. How he was such a good guy. And I believed them. I felt so proud, so grateful to have someone who was more than just my boyfriend. He was my teammate. And I was proud of how much we'd grown as a couple. How we'd managed to build a life that was comfortable, happy, and full of love. I didn't need anything else. I didn't even think there was a chance of things falling apart. Not with us. And I guess that's why I'm still stunned. Still sitting here trying to wrap my head around how he could have betrayed me like he did. Because I never saw it coming. Not once. For years, I felt like I was the luckiest person. Someone who'd found her soulmate early in life. But then he told me everything. And now, it's like all those years, all those memories we made together, are tainted by this huge, ugly truth that I just can't seem to process. It's like I've been living in a dream. And suddenly someone came along and yanked me awake. And nothing feels real anymore. That night, when he called and asked if he could come over, I didn't think anything of it. I mean, he'd done it 100 times before. Just needed to vent or relax after a stressful day. It was our thing. I was used to him showing up. Sometimes late, just so he could lay his head on my shoulder. And I'd listen, give him a little comfort. So I didn't hesitate for a second when he asked to come by. It was second nature. But this time, he didn't just walk in, throw his bag down, and give me one of those tired smiles like he usually did. No, this time he walked in, looked me straight in the eyes, and hugged me like he was about to say goodbye forever. He held me so tight I could barely breathe. And then he whispered that what he had to say was going to make me hate him. I remember laughing it off, telling him to just spit it out, thinking he was exaggerating. I wasn't prepared for what came next. I've been cheating on you, he said, just like that, plain, simple, like he was admitting he'd forgotten to pick up milk on his way home. And I swear, I still thought he was joking at first. It was so out of character, so completely opposite of everything I thought I knew about him. But when he looked at me, his eyes weren't filled with mischief or teasing. They were full of regret, sorrow, and something else, maybe shame? I don't know. All I remember is that sinking feeling, like the floor had disappeared from under me. And when he started crying, it became clear, this wasn't a joke. He was dead serious. I couldn't even speak. I just sat there, numb, as he told me everything. He didn't hold back a single detail. Told me how it happened, when it happened, even why he thought he'd done it. He tried to paint this picture of a man who'd been flattered, tempted, weak, someone who got caught up in a moment, if you can even call it that. But I wasn't hearing any of it. All I could think was, how could you do this to us? He told me he'd been with her 4 times. The first time was at some party she threw. The last time was just a month ago. He said he'd been drawn in by the way she flirted with him. How she'd gone out of her way to make him feel special. To build him up, and the whole time, he knew exactly what he was doing. Knew that if he stayed, if he flirted back, it would lead to, well, exactly what it led to. And he did it anyway. Listening to him, I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. I couldn't wrap my mind around the fact that this was happening. That this man, who I'd trusted with everything, who I thought was the one, was sitting here, confessing to a betrayal I never thought I'd have to face. Every time he tried to explain, it just sounded worse, because he knew what he was doing. And he chose it anyway, over and over again. And the worst part? He told me he was confessing because the guilt was eating him alive. Like that was supposed to make me feel better. Like I was supposed to be grateful that he'd finally decided to come clean. That he wanted to give me the freedom to choose whether to stay. I mean, can you believe that? 7 years, and he thinks freedom to choose is what I needed. It's funny, looking back, because I'd never doubted him before. Not once. I had this image of him as someone who was committed, reliable, maybe even a little boring. In the best way. And in that moment, it all crumbled. I sat there, barely able to look at him, feeling like the person I'd known for years had been a stranger all along. Like he'd been wearing a mask, playing a role, and now the mask had finally come off. By the time he finished, I was just empty. There weren't even tears yet. Just this cold, hollow feeling, like my heart had shut down and was refusing to process anymore. And when he asked me if I could ever forgive him, if I'd give him a second chance, all I could do was shake my head. Because how do you even answer that? How do you respond to someone who's shattered everything you've built together and is now asking you to just sweep it all under the rug? I didn't answer him. I couldn't. I just told him to leave. And as he walked out the door, I wondered if I'd ever feel whole again. After he left, the silence in my apartment felt suffocating. I just sat there, still as a statue, staring at the wall. I was trying to make sense of everything he'd told me, but it felt like my brain had shut down, refusing to let in any more of the reality that had just been dumped in my lap. I'd always thought heartbreak would be loud, full of screaming and sobbing, like in those old romance movies. But it wasn't. Not for me. Anyway, it was just quiet, cold, like everything inside me had gone numb. I couldn't stop replaying his words over and over in my head. Every detail he'd shared about those nights with her. The parties, the flirtation, the choices he made to stay, knowing exactly where it would lead. And, God, the way he described it so plainly, as if it was just some minor thing he had to get off his chest so he could feel better. The whole time, I kept thinking, this can't be real, this can't be my life. At some point, I finally got up and wandered into the kitchen. I don't even know what I was looking for, comfort, distraction, something to make it all stop. I ended up grabbing a glass of water, taking a sip, and just staring at my reflection in the darkened window. I looked hollow, like someone had scooped out everything that made me, and left behind this empty shell. A wave of memories started crashing over me then. I thought about all the times I'd laughed with him, shared my dreams with him, trusted him with things I'd never told anyone else. I remembered the late night talks, the vacations, the silly inside jokes that felt like they belonged to another lifetime. Those memories should have felt comforting, but instead, they were like tiny daggers, each one piercing me with the realization that he'd managed to keep this whole other side of himself hidden from me. He'd lied to my face, over and over, for months. How do you come back from that? The worst part was, even with all the pain he'd caused me, I still loved him. I hated myself for it. But it was true. I loved him, and that made everything so much harder. It's one thing to walk away from someone who's a total stranger, who you can just write off as a mistake. But this was a man I built my life around, someone who I'd envisioned a future with, and now I had to decide if I could ever trust him again. I think I sat in that kitchen for hours, just going over everything in my mind, trying to make sense of my feelings. On one hand, I felt like he'd ripped out a part of me I'd never get back. On the other hand, I couldn't shake this tiny sliver of hope, this pathetic little whisper that maybe, just maybe, we could fix this. Maybe he'd learned his lesson. Maybe he really was sorry. Maybe we could find a way back to what we had. It was like my heart and my head were at war, each one pulling me in a different direction. But then I thought about what he'd done, how he'd looked me in the eyes and lied to me, over and over, while he was sneaking around with her. He didn't just make a mistake, he made a choice to betray me. A choice to put himself first. A choice to break everything we built together. And if he could make those choices once, who's to say he wouldn't make them again? I spent the rest of the night pacing my apartment, going back and forth between anger, heartbreak, and exhaustion. I'd never felt so lost, so completely uncertain of what to do. Part of me wanted to call him, to scream at him, to demand answers, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. Nothing he could say would make it better. The damage was done, and I was the one left to pick up the pieces. As the sun started to rise, I finally made a decision. I wasn't going to reach out to him. I wasn't going to beg him to stay or try to fix things. I needed to focus on myself, to figure out who I was without him, to see if I could find some way to move forward on my own. I didn't know if I was strong enough to do it, but I knew I had to try, because at the end of the day, I deserved better than someone who could betray me like that. And as painful as it was, I told myself that maybe this heartbreak was a chance for me to grow, to learn to stand on my own 2 feet, to build a life that didn't revolve around someone else. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was going to put myself first. The days that followed were strange. I don't know if I've ever felt anything like it. It's like I was living in a fog, just drifting from one moment to the next, barely aware of what was happening around me. I'd go to work, do the bare minimum to get through the day, come home, and then just sit there, completely still, letting the silence settle around me. Everything felt muted, like someone had turned the volume down on my life. I didn't know what to do with all the emotions swirling inside me. Sometimes, I felt like screaming, like going out and shattering something just to feel the relief of release. Other times, I felt so exhausted that even moving felt like a chore. I'd lie on the couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every moment we'd shared, and wondering if there was something I'd missed. Some sign, some clue that would have let me see this coming. But there was nothing, just the empty spaces where love used to be. I kept questioning everything about our relationship. Were there things I'd ignored? Times I'd brushed off some minor incident that, looking back, should have been a red flag? Had I just been too trusting? Too naive? I wanted to believe I was someone who knew her own mind, who understood the world, but now, I felt like a fool. Like all those years we'd spent together had been a lie. A beautiful illusion that shattered the second he stepped out of our relationship and into hers. And yet, even as I wrestled with all of this, a part of me still felt love, or something close to it. It was like this stubborn, unyielding attachment that wouldn't go away. No matter how hard I tried to shake it, I'd get angry, furious even, at myself for still caring. How could I still feel anything but rage towards someone who'd betrayed me like that? How could I still feel that tug in my chest? That longing to have him back, to return to the way things were before? But love isn't logical. It doesn't play by any set of rules that make sense. It's messy and complicated and doesn't care about what's fair or reasonable. I hated myself for feeling that way. But there it was, a tangled mix of anger, hurt, and this lingering attachment that I didn't know how to untangle. And because of that, I started to doubt myself. I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was a way to work through this, to rebuild what we'd lost. But then I'd remember what he did. The lies, the betrayal, the way he'd so casually made a choice that would destroy everything between us. And that anger, that deep, burning anger, would flare up again, reminding me of why I'd made the decision to walk away in the first place. It was like being pulled in two different directions. My heart and my mind constantly at war, each one trying to convince me of something different. I wanted so badly to reach out to someone, to talk about what I was going through, but I didn't know where to start. I didn't want pity, and I didn't want judgment. I just wanted someone to understand, to tell me that I wasn't crazy for feeling all these conflicting emotions. But every time I tried to put my feelings into words, it felt too raw, too messy, so I kept it all inside, letting it fester, hoping that eventually, the pain would fade, that the confusion would clear, and I'd be able to find some kind of peace. In those days, I learned that grief isn't just about losing someone, it's about losing the future you thought you'd have. The dreams you built around that person. I had to mourn the life we'd planned together, the future we'd talked about, the family we wanted to build, and that kind of grief is its own kind of hell. It's a quiet, unrelenting ache that doesn't go away, no matter how hard you try to ignore it. I wanted to believe that time would heal me, that with enough days, enough distance, I'd be able to look back and feel nothing. But in those early days, that felt impossible. The pain was too fresh, too consuming, and yet, somewhere deep inside, there was a tiny glimmer of hope. This small voice that whispered, "You'll get through this." I didn't know if I believed it, but I held onto it, because in a world that felt completely shattered, that tiny sliver of hope was all I had. I don't know if I'll ever forget the day his mom called me. It was so out of the blue. I hadn't been talking to many people, and the last person I expected to hear from was her. I almost didn't answer. My first instinct was to ignore it. Let it go to voicemail. But something in me said to pick up. So I did. She didn't dance around the issue. She got right to the point. Told me she knew what happened. That he'd confessed to her too. She sounded sad, disappointed, almost as if she was grieving the loss of the relationship just as much as I was. And in some strange way, I found comfort in that. It was like, finally, someone else understood the depth of the pain I was going through. She didn't try to excuse him or talk me into giving him another chance. Instead, she offered an apology, not just for him, but on behalf of their whole family. She said she'd raised him better than this, that she never expected him to hurt someone the way he hurt me. And then, she did something I didn't see coming. She offered to help me, to support me through this however she could. She said if I needed space, she'd make sure he didn't bother me. If I needed someone to talk to, she'd be there, no judgment. She even offered to take back any gifts he'd given me, if that would help me move on. Her kindness threw me for a loop. I mean, here was this woman, who had every reason to stand by her son. But instead, she was reaching out to me, showing me compassion when she could have easily turned a blind eye. It was a strange, bittersweet moment, finding comfort in the very family I felt betrayed by. I thanked her, told her I wasn't sure what I needed yet, but I appreciated her kindness. We didn't talk long, there was a lot left unsaid, but I hung up the phone feeling a small weight lifted. It was as if, by acknowledging the pain he'd caused, she'd given me permission to feel it fully, without second-guessing myself. After we hung up, I sat there, thinking about all the times I'd spent with his family. All the holidays, birthdays, dinners where I'd felt like part of their world. It was one of the things I'd loved most about our relationship, that feeling of belonging. And now, that was gone too. His mom's offer had been comforting, but it also reminded me of everything I was losing. Not just him, but the life we'd built together. The people who'd become like family to me. I wasn't just grieving the end of a relationship. I was grieving the end of a whole chapter of my life. And yet, something about her reaching out gave me a little bit of strength. It was like she'd given me permission to set boundaries, to decide what I needed to heal, instead of worrying about how he felt or what anyone else thought. For the first time since all of this happened, I felt a spark of clarity, a reminder that I didn't have to let him define this story for me. I could take control, decide how I wanted to move forward, whether that meant cutting ties completely or finding a way to forgive him in my own time. In a way, his mom's call gave me back a piece of myself. It was a reminder that I was more than just his girlfriend. More than the girl who'd been cheated on. I was a person with my own life. My own choices, and I didn't have to let his betrayal dictate how I moved forward. It wouldn't be easy, and I knew there would be days when the pain felt too heavy to carry. But I also knew, deep down, that I was strong enough to handle this. I could make it through to the other side. Find a way to rebuild, even if it took a while to figure out what that looked like. I wish I could say that phone call fixed everything. That it was some kind of turning point where I suddenly felt free. But it wasn't that simple. The pain was still there, raw and real, and I knew it would be a long time before it faded. But that call planted a seed of hope. A reminder that I didn't have to go through this alone. There were people who cared about me, who wanted to help, even if they were connected to him. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sliver of strength. A small voice telling me that maybe, just maybe, I was going to be okay. After that phone call with his mom, I thought I'd start feeling better. Maybe not healed, but at least like I could see the way forward. And, in a way, I did. For a moment, I felt that small spark of strength. A glimmer of hope, but that feeling was fleeting. Like catching a glimpse of the sun on a cloudy day. Because as much as I wanted to lean into that hope, my mind kept circling back to the betrayal, to the thought of him with someone else, and to the future I was supposed to have with him, a future that felt shattered beyond recognition. In the days that followed, I found myself going over our relationship in excruciating detail. It was like my mind was stuck in a loop, replaying memories, conversations, and moments that now felt tainted. I'd think back to dinners we shared, where he would sit across from me, laughing and holding my hand, all while this secret betrayal hung in the air. Unspoken, every, "I love you," he'd said, every promise he'd made, they all felt like lies now. I couldn't help but wonder, had he really meant any of it? Or had he just been playing a part, telling me what I wanted to hear? And then, there were the questions I had about myself. What did it say about me that he'd felt the need to look elsewhere? Was there something I hadn't given him? Had I missed some sign that he was unhappy? That he was slipping away? I'd always believed we had an honest, open relationship, that we shared everything, but now, I questioned everything. It was as if I was trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit. Scrambling to understand where things went wrong. The worst part was, every time I thought about moving on, about putting this behind me, I felt this deep pang of guilt. I kept thinking about how he'd come to me, confessed, and begged for another chance. He'd told me he'd do whatever it took to earn my trust back. That he was willing to wait as long as I needed, and that made everything so much harder because, despite my anger, there was a part of me that still loved him. A part of me that wanted to believe he was telling the truth. That he really was sorry. That maybe, just maybe, this was something we could work through together. But forgiving him felt impossible. Every time I thought about giving him another chance, the image of him with her would flash in my mind, and I'd feel this overwhelming wave of anger and hurt all over again. It was like a physical ache, this pain that wouldn't let me go, and I couldn't ignore the voice in the back of my head. The one that kept whispering, "Once a cheater, always a cheater." I'd heard that phrase so many times, seen it play out in so many stories. And now I couldn't help but wonder if it was true. If I stayed, would I just be setting myself up for more pain down the road? The few people I'd confided in had their own opinions, of course. Some of them told me to walk away, to save myself the heartache of trying to rebuild something that was broken beyond repair. Others said I should give him a chance, that he'd come clean and that honesty should count for something. And then there were those who simply listened, who didn't offer advice or try to sway me one way or the other. They just let me talk, let me vent, let me work through the confusion and the hurt in my own time. Honestly, it was those conversations, the ones without judgment, without advice, that helped the most. It was in those quiet moments, talking to people who just listened, that I started to hear my own voice again, my own wants, my own needs, buried beneath the noise of everyone else's opinions and my own self-doubt. I realized that I was the one who had to live with this decision. That I couldn't make a choice based on what anyone else thought or expected. This was my life, my heart, and I needed to do what felt right for me. And yet, even with that clarity, the decision felt impossible. I'd go back and forth a dozen times a day. I'd imagine myself giving him another chance, working through the pain together, and rebuilding our relationship stronger than before. But then, just as quickly, I'd see myself walking away, finding strength in leaving, in taking control of my own happiness and refusing to settle for a relationship that had been tainted by betrayal. I started thinking about trust, about what it meant to me, and how it was the foundation of everything we'd built together. Trust wasn't just something you could piece back together with apologies and promises. It was something deeper, something fragile, and once it was broken, I wasn't sure it could ever be whole again. Even if I did stay, I knew I'd always have doubts. I'd always wonder where he was, what he was doing, if he was keeping something from me. And that wasn't the kind of relationship I wanted. So, I tried something new. I gave myself permission to sit with the pain, to really feel it, without trying to fix it or find a way out. I let myself grieve the loss of what we had, the future I thought we'd share. I let myself mourn the trust that had been broken, the love that felt different now, like something foreign and unfamiliar. And in that process, I realized something. I didn't have to decide right now. I didn't have to have all the answers. I could give myself time to heal, time to figure out what I wanted, without the pressure of making a choice right away. It was a strange feeling. This idea of letting go without actually letting go. I wasn't ready to cut ties completely, but I also wasn't ready to jump back into the relationship. I told myself it was okay to be in this in-between place. To take it day by day, moment by moment, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a little bit of peace. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small step toward healing, a small reminder that I had the strength to make it through this. No matter where I ended up. And maybe, in the end, that was enough. I didn't have to have it all figured out. I didn't have to have a clear path forward. I just had to trust myself, to listen to my own heart, and to believe that, eventually, I'd find the answer I was looking for. I spent days, no, weeks, really, caught up in this mental fog, tangled up in my own thoughts and memories. I'd drift through the house, passing by pictures of us, reminders of the life we'd built together, the plans we'd made. Every little thing was a trigger, a favorite song, the spot on the couch where we'd sit and laugh about the most random stuff, the quiet corner of the bedroom where we'd talk about our dreams for the future. All those memories just felt hollow now, like shadows of something I could never quite grasp again. It was like I'd lost someone. I mean, I know he's still here, still messaging me, still trying to fix things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd lost the version of him I fell in love with. The person who made me feel safe, like I was his world. That person was gone, replaced by someone I didn't quite know or understand. And every time he'd message or show up, I'd feel that same mix of anger and heartbreak all over again. So, I did something I hadn't done since we broke up. I decided to revisit the good times. Not to remind myself of what I'd lost, but to understand why I was so shattered. I needed to face the memories head on, to really grasp why it hurt so damn much. I spent a whole night going through old photos, scrolling through messages, just immersing myself in the story of us, our little journey. I relived our first date, the way we'd laughed so hard we couldn't breathe, the silly moments, the big milestones, the quiet nights we'd just sit together, saying nothing because it felt perfect just like that. And as much as it hurt, there was something healing about it too. It reminded me of why I'd loved him, of all the beautiful moments we'd shared. I knew I didn't regret those years, no matter how things had turned out. He'd shown me what love could be, what it felt like to be with someone who understood you in all your weirdness, who loved you for all your quirks and flaws. And as painful as it was to think about, I knew those memories were mine to keep, something he couldn't take away. That's when I realized, maybe it's okay that love changes. Maybe it's okay that sometimes, the people we love don't end up being who we thought they were. Or maybe they just lose their way. It doesn't mean the love wasn't real, it just means people are human. And humans mess up, a lot. And even though I hated what he did, I couldn't deny that he was still the same person who made me feel things I didn't know I was capable of feeling. The thing is, though, I knew I couldn't live in those memories. They were part of my past, but they didn't define my future. So, after that night of reliving it all, I made a promise to myself. I promised that I'd start building new memories for me. Without him, that I'd start thinking about what I wanted in life. Beyond the relationship, beyond the hurt. And I took my first step the next day. It was small, just going out for a coffee with a friend. But it was something. For the first time since everything happened, I laughed, a real, genuine laugh, and felt something that wasn't pain or regret. It felt like the tiniest crack of light breaking through the clouds. And I realized I hadn't lost myself completely. I was still there, buried under all the hurt, just waiting to come back out. After that, I made it a habit to do something every day that was just for me. I'd go on long walks, start a new book, even tried painting just for the heck of it. It didn't take the pain away, but it helped me see that life goes on. The world keeps turning, and as hard as it was to accept, I could keep moving too. Every time he reached out, asking for another chance, promising he'd never hurt me again, I reminded myself of the promise I made. Not the promise to him, but the promise to myself, to put my own happiness first, to protect my own heart. And every time I told him, not yet, it got a little easier, a little less painful. I didn't shut the door completely, but I kept it just barely open, a reminder that if I chose to walk away, that was okay too. I wish I could say I found some magic answer, that I knew exactly what to do. But the truth is, I was still figuring it out. Some days, the memories felt like daggers, stabbing me over and over. Other days, I'd feel almost free, like I was finally letting go of a weight I'd been carrying for so long. I knew healing wasn't linear. There'd be ups and downs, and I'd have to give myself permission to feel whatever came up. So, here I am now, in this weird in-between space. Not quite sure if I'll ever fully forgive him or if I even want to. But I know one thing for sure. I've learned more about myself in these past few weeks than I ever thought possible. I've learned that I'm stronger than I realized. That I have the power to protect my heart and make choices for me. And maybe, just maybe, that's the silver lining in all of this, that even in the darkest times, we can find a way to keep going, to find a little bit of light. And wherever that path takes me next, I know I'll be okay. After that night, after making peace with some of those memories, I started to feel different. Not like everything was magically okay, but like I'd finally untied the knots that had been choking me. I could finally breathe again. Maybe just a little, and with each breath, I felt a little more like me. The person I was before all this chaos. The one who was strong. Who believed in love but also in boundaries. In respect. In herself. Every day, it got a little easier to tell myself I was making the right choice. That I could stand firm even when my heart wanted to run back to the familiar. Even when he'd message me again with those apologies. With his, "I'll do anything to make this right, please." And every time he reached out, a tiny piece of me wondered if maybe it was worth one more try. But then, I'd remember all the hurt. All the times I'd stood there wondering why I wasn't enough. Questioning every move I'd made in our relationship. Wondering if I could have done something differently to keep him from breaking my heart. But that wasn't fair, not to me, not to everything I'd done to make this relationship work. I'd given him trust, support, and loyalty, things that had once felt unbreakable, like our love was some sort of fortress that could withstand anything. But I guess I realized that fortresses can crumble if one person decides they don't need to keep it standing. He'd chosen to be selfish, to seek out whatever thrill he thought he needed to feel fulfilled. And as much as I wanted to believe his apologies, I knew those actions had to mean something too. It was strange, this feeling of moving on, because I'd always believed, moving on, was like switching off a light. One day you're hurt. And the next day you're fine. But it was nothing like that. Moving on was slow, painful, confusing. Some days I'd wake up feeling strong, almost invincible, and other days I'd feel a wave of doubt, wondering if maybe I was throwing away something I'd never find again. But then, in the quiet moments, those little slices of peace I'd carved out for myself, I'd feel a glimmer of clarity. I'd remember that I wasn't moving on to prove a point or to punish him. I was moving on to protect myself, to take care of the person who'd been through hell and still managed to get up every day. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about me, and I don't think I'd ever truly thought about it that way before. My whole life, I'd been so focused on being good for other people, on making everyone else happy, that I'd kind of lost track of what I needed, what I wanted. His cheating was a betrayal, sure, but it was also a wake-up call, a reminder that I deserved more than someone who could treat my trust like an afterthought. So, I started focusing on what I wanted my life to look like. And honestly, it didn't look like the life we'd planned together. At least not anymore. I'd had a vision of our future, this beautiful, shared life filled with love and laughter and all the good things. But as I sat down and really thought about what I wanted, I realized that vision wasn't set in stone. I could make my own future, one that didn't rely on anyone else's choices, anyone else's promises. The more I thought about it, the more I felt this strange sense of freedom. I didn't need to wait around for him to prove he could be faithful or trustworthy again. I didn't need to put my dreams on hold while he figured out how to be the person he'd promised he was. I could just start fresh, not forget what we had, but carry those lessons forward and leave the pain behind. I spent hours dreaming up what that fresh start could look like. Maybe I'd travel somewhere new, throw myself into a hobby I'd always wanted to try but never got around to. Maybe I'd take a risk, one that had nothing to do with anyone else, something just for me. I could create a life where I didn't have to compromise on trust or settle for half-hearted apologies. And with that, I began to see the possibilities, a vision of my life that felt exciting, hopeful. For the first time in a long time, I was thinking about a future that didn't involve him, and it wasn't sad or bitter, it was freeing. Like stepping into the sun after months of clouds. I knew there'd still be rainy days, that the pain wouldn't just disappear, but I also knew I was strong enough to face them. I'd survive the worst of it. I could handle whatever came next. So, as I stood on the edge of this new beginning, I made a promise to myself, one I intended to keep. I would never lose sight of my own worth again. I would never let someone else's choices define how I felt about myself. I'd hold on to the love, the lessons, but I'd leave the pain behind, right where it belonged. And with that, I was ready to embrace the life I wanted, on my terms, ready to be my own person, to find joy in my own company, to let go of what no longer served me. It was time to turn the page, to step into the unknown with open arms and an open heart. I was finally ready to move forward, to live my life fully. For me, when I say I was ready to move forward, I mean it, at least. I thought I did. I'd made the decision in my head, wrapped my mind around the idea that I was starting fresh. But the truth is, letting go is never as clean or easy as you want it to be. It's messy, sometimes painful, and more often than not, it feels like you're taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. In the weeks that followed, I tried my best to stick to my new path, focusing on myself, letting the idea of us fade into the background. But some days, the idea of that clean break felt like a distant dream. It's amazing how quickly I could slip back into old memories, how my mind would replay moments that felt so small at the time but now felt monumental. Every text message he'd sent during those nights out, every "I love you" he'd whispered before we fell asleep. All of it would come rushing back when I least expected it. But in those moments, I reminded myself that memories are just that, memories. They were fragments of a time that no longer existed, pieces of a story that had already ended. And as much as it hurt to let go of those memories, I knew I couldn't build a future if I was still clinging to the past. So, I started small. I deleted his number from my favorites, then from my contacts altogether. I packed up the little mementos, photos, Gifts. The concert ticket stubs from our favorite shows together, and put them in a box. I didn't throw them away, I wasn't quite there yet. But I put them out of sight. Somewhere that felt far enough away to keep me grounded in the present. And, in a strange way, those little acts of separation felt empowering. Each step, each decision to distance myself, was a reminder that I was in control. I didn't have to be bound to the choices he'd made or the mistakes that had shattered our relationship. I was choosing myself, choosing to create a space where I could breathe, where I could grow without the weight of betrayal looming over me. As the days turned into weeks, I felt myself changing. Bit by bit, I'd catch myself smiling more, feeling lighter, feeling hopeful. I started filling my time with things that brought me genuine joy, things I hadn't realized I'd been neglecting. I took up painting again, something I'd loved in college but had put aside because, somehow, life always seemed too busy. I began reading books I'd been putting off, letting myself get lost in worlds that weren't my own. I even signed up for a weekend hiking group, just to get out, breathe fresh air, and remind myself there was a world outside of the memories I'd been drowning in. And through all of this, I started reconnecting with who I was. Outside of him, I rediscovered the parts of myself that had been buried, the dreams and interests I'd set aside in favor of building our perfect life together. I started to feel like me again, like someone I hadn't seen in years. Of course, there were setbacks, nights when I'd lie awake, still replaying everything he'd told me, every excuse he'd made, every apology that had felt hollow even as I'd wanted so badly to believe it. But now, instead of letting those thoughts consume me, I'd let myself feel the hurt and then remind myself that I was moving forward. I'd think of everything I was gaining by letting go, the peace, the freedom, the possibility of a life where I didn't have to compromise on trust. And as that freedom grew, I felt something else, a sense of gratitude, not for him or for what happened, but for the strength I'd found within myself. I'd spent so much of my life worrying about how others saw me. If I was good enough, if I was lovable enough. But this journey showed me that the most important thing was how I saw myself. That I could be whole on my own. That I didn't need anyone else to define my worth. That realization, that I was enough as I was, became my anchor. It kept me steady on the days when the past felt too close. When the temptation to reach out, to seek closure or answers or anything that might make sense of the chaos, was overwhelming, I'd remind myself that the only closure I needed was the one I was building. One step at a time. With every choice I made for myself. Letting go wasn't about erasing the memories or pretending none of it happened. It was about accepting that those moments were part of my life. Part of my story, but that they didn't have to define me. I could carry the lessons forward without carrying the weight of the pain. So, I kept going. I kept choosing myself, kept building a life that felt true to who I was and who I wanted to become. And with each day, I felt a little lighter, a little braver, a little more at peace. I don't know what the future holds, but for the first time in a long time, I'm okay with that. I'm ready to see where this journey takes me, ready to embrace the unknown, knowing that I have the strength to face whatever comes my way. And that, I think, is the greatest gift I could have given myself, the freedom to live my life on my own terms. With my own happiness at the center, I'd finally let go, and in doing so, I'd found myself again. So here I am, standing on the edge of a new chapter, looking forward, finally free from the weight of the past. I never thought I'd get here. If you'd asked me a few months ago, I would have said I'd probably still be trying to hold on, figuring out what went wrong, or clinging to the what ifs and maybes. But now, those thoughts feel like faded echoes. I'm not saying they're gone completely, they still pop up, like unwelcome reminders, but they don't have the same hold on me anymore. They don't have the power to derail my day or make me question my own worth. I've spent so much time rediscovering myself that I feel like a new version of who I was. Not someone else entirely, but someone with more clarity. Someone who knows her own boundaries, her own worth, and won't compromise them just to keep someone else happy. I've learned that self-respect isn't something you should ever put on the back burner. No matter how much you love someone, love is supposed to build you up, not break you down. And if it does the latter, it's not the right kind of love. In fact, I've realized I want more than just love. I want respect, kindness, understanding, and someone who values me without needing to be reminded of my worth. I've come to see how important it is to have those qualities in a partner and in myself. My time of mourning what I thought we had is over. Now, I'm ready to live in the present and create a future that's built on a solid foundation. Not one that's crumbling under the weight of betrayal. I don't know if I'll ever see him again. And strangely, I'm okay with that. At first, the thought terrified me, that I'd have to live my life knowing that he's out there, somewhere, while I'm here, rebuilding. But now, I realize he was only ever a chapter, a part of the story that brought me to where I am now. I wouldn't be this person without what happened, and in a way, I'm grateful for that, not grateful for the hurt, but for the strength it gave me. Now, my days are filled with things that feel like me, that bring me joy. I'm making plans, not just to fill the empty spaces but to truly live. I'm setting goals I used to put off, telling myself I was too busy, or not ready. I've started to imagine what my life can look like if I prioritize myself. And it's freeing. For the first time, the future doesn't feel like a question mark. It feels like an open door, waiting for me to step through. I'm not sure what's next, But I do know I'm excited about the possibilities. I'm eager to see what I'm capable of, to see what life feels like when I'm living it for me. Not for anyone else. I know it might not all be smooth sailing, but I'm prepared for that. I know I can handle whatever comes my way because I've already proven to myself that I can face the hardest moments and come out stronger. And if I do meet someone else one day, well, I know what I want now. What I deserve. I won't settle, and I won't make excuses for anyone who doesn't meet me with the same honesty and respect that I fought to build in myself. I'll approach love differently, wiser and more grounded, knowing that I'm whole on my own. And if that person never comes along, I'm okay with that, too. I've found enough within myself to fill any empty spaces. There's a strange kind of peace in letting go. A calm that comes from realizing that you don't have to have it all figured out to move forward. I'm not sure where this journey will take me, but I'm ready to embrace every step, open to whatever life has in store. And that feels like the truest freedom of all, letting go of the need for certainty and just letting life unfold. Trusting that I'll be okay, no matter what. So, this is where I am now, standing at the threshold of a life that's finally mine.
AITAH for breaking up my family and purposefully causing my stepmom to lose her child's custody and my father his? When I think back on my life, there's this one constant that's always been there. No matter what, family. Now, family can mean a lot of things to different people, but for me, it always meant security, support, and love. And if you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I would have said I had one of the best, most connected families out there. A modern family, if you will. That's what we always called it, laughing about how much we blended, despite not being exactly traditional. I mean, I had my mom, my dad, and then there was my stepmom, who honestly might have understood me better than anyone else. Growing up, my stepmom wasn't just a parent by marriage. She was someone I felt close to, trusted, and could talk to about pretty much anything. She'd always been one of those genuinely kind people. You know, she would go out of her way to make sure we felt like one big family. Never letting me or my brother feel like we were just half, or step, anything. She came into my life when I was young, so she was there for all those important moments, birthdays, my first heartbreak, my high school graduation, and through it all, she showed me that family could be made, not just born. My father and I, we were close, sure, but we didn't always see eye to eye. And my mom was around too, but we weren't as tight. So yeah, my stepmom, she was like my anchor. Then there's my little brother, who's 12, and my stepsister, 10. They're incredible kids, bright, funny, and just full of life. They're the kind of siblings that make you feel like the world is a little lighter. You know, even though they're young, they were a huge part of my life. I always felt this weird responsibility to watch out for them, especially with how close we were. Family gatherings? They were everything. We'd do the usual things, birthdays, holidays, vacations, nothing fancy. Just close-knit memories that I thought we'd keep making forever. And then the pandemic hit. Like it did for everyone else. It threw our whole family off balance. We couldn't see each other as much. Couldn't just drop by whenever. I ended up moving away for work right as it was all starting, thinking I'd be back soon. But everything kept changing, and before I knew it, I hadn't been back in months. It was strange, missing all the day-to-day stuff. Like casual dinners or those lazy Sundays spent together. I told myself it'd go back to normal soon enough. That we'd get through it. But even with the distance, I stayed in touch. I made sure to check in with everyone, especially my little brother and stepsister. I didn't want them to feel like I was disappearing, not with everything else going on. And they'd tell me bits and pieces about home life, saying things were okay. I could tell things were a bit tense, but it didn't seem like a big deal. My dad and stepmom were stressed, but who wasn't? It felt normal enough. I mean, it was a tough time for everyone. Things started to get weird around the time my dad and stepmom announced they were expecting. I remember when they told us, everyone was excited. Me included. I thought a new baby could bring something fresh and joyful. Something to look forward to in a time where so much felt out of control. My brother and stepsister were thrilled. Their faces lit up at the thought of a new sibling. It felt like we were adding to our little family unit in a way that made us all feel closer. Even with the miles between us. But not too long after that, I noticed things were different. It wasn't one specific thing at first. More like a subtle shift in how my dad and stepmom interacted with us and each other. The few times I visited, they seemed distracted, like they had this invisible weight hanging over them. I brushed it off as just the typical stress of preparing for a new baby. I figured they were just dealing with all the usual changes. But I noticed that my stepmom, especially, had become more withdrawn. She wasn't as lively, not as interested in the little things she used to care about. Like planning family outings or chatting with me for hours about life. She'd always been the rock, the one who held everything together. So seeing her like this? It felt off. It wasn't just her demeanor either. The way she talked to my dad. The way they seemed to tiptoe around each other. It was like they were navigating some unspoken tension I couldn't quite put my finger on. I tried to talk to her about it, you know, just to see if she was okay. She'd brush it off, say everything was fine, that it was just hormones, pregnancy stuff, but I could sense something else lurking behind her words. Like there was more going on than she wanted to admit. As the pregnancy went on, things only got worse. Every time I check in with my siblings, they'd mention that she seemed more irritable, snapping over little things that wouldn't have even fazed her before. At first, I thought maybe she was just overwhelmed, that it'd all settle once the baby was here. But hearing my brother talk about her yelling at him over leaving a book on the table, or my stepsister getting scolded for something as simple as spilling a drink, it worried me. It didn't sound like the stepmom I knew, the one who used to be so patient, who'd laugh things off instead of making a big deal. And my dad? He just checked out. That's the best way I can describe it. He threw himself into his work, spending more and more hours away from home. I knew he could be distant sometimes, but this was different. It was like he was deliberately avoiding being around. The more things went south, the more he retreated. My siblings told me he'd come home late, barely say a word, and head straight to bed. And if there was any kind of tension in the house, he wouldn't address it. He'd just ignore it, like pretending it wasn't there would somehow make it go away. Then, when the baby was finally born, I thought things might improve. I hoped the excitement of a new little one in the house would bring back some of the warmth that had been missing. But instead, it was like adding fuel to a fire that had already been smoldering for too long. My stepmom became more irritable, more on edge, and my dad? He buried himself even deeper into his work. The worst part was hearing how it affected my brother and stepsister. They'd tell me about her outbursts, how she'd yell over the smallest things, or how she'd go silent for hours, ignoring them as if they weren't even there. It broke my heart. I'd never known her to be this way, and it was confusing for them too. They'd ask me if I thought she was mad at them, if they'd done something wrong. How do you explain to kids that it's not about them, that sometimes people just go through things? I didn't know what to say, so I'd reassure them the best I could, telling them it'd get better soon. But I was starting to wonder if I even believed that myself. As the months passed, things didn't just stay bad, they escalated. My siblings would tell me stories that left a sinking feeling in my stomach. I wanted to believe that what they were experiencing was just an intense adjustment period, that maybe things were being blown out of proportion. But then my brother called me one night, his voice small and shaky, and I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. He told me about how my stepmom had gotten furious with him over something as minor as leaving his shoes by the door. She'd screamed at him, calling him careless, selfish, and saying things that just weren't okay to say to a kid. He said he'd tried to apologize, but she just kept going. And then, in the middle of his story, he paused and asked me if I thought he was a bad kid. That question hit me like a punch to the gut. My brother, this sweet, gentle kid who looked up to everyone, who just wanted everyone to get along, was now questioning his worth because of what he was hearing at home. I tried to stay calm, but inside I was fuming. I wanted to jump in my car, drive over, and tell her to leave my brother alone. But I knew I couldn't just storm it like that. My siblings needed me to be the steady one, the one who'd think things through. So instead, I told him that none of this was his fault, that sometimes adults don't act right and that it had nothing to do with him. But I could tell it didn't quite sink in. When kids hear stuff like that day after day, it starts to shape how they see themselves, no matter what anyone else says. After that call, I tried talking to my dad again. I told him everything my siblings had told me, laid it all out there. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I wanted him to understand that this wasn't just typical family stress. It was something that was starting to leave scars on those kids. But he was like a brick wall. He mumbled something about how things were difficult and complicated, and how my stepmom was just going through a rough patch. It was like he was making excuses for her, refusing to face the reality of what was happening. I told him he needed to step up, that he couldn't just ignore it. But he brushed me off, saying he'd handle it in his own way, which, judging by how things had been going, meant he'd keep on pretending nothing was wrong. It wasn't long after that when I got a call from my stepsister. And her story was somehow even worse. She told me that one night, after my stepmom had put the baby to bed, she'd come into her room, yelling at her for something trivial, like not finishing her homework on time. My stepsister was just a little girl, barely old enough to understand why anyone would get that mad over something so small. She said that when she tried to apologize, my stepmom got in her face, telling her she was lucky to even be part of this family. Can you imagine hearing that as a kid? Being told you're lucky to be included in your own home? I kept my composure on the phone, but the second we hung up, I punched the wall. I was furious at my stepmom for turning into someone so unrecognizable, furious at my dad for his spineless response, and furious at myself for not knowing how to fix this. Every part of me wanted to go over there and do something drastic. But I knew that wasn't the answer. I needed to keep it together, not just for myself, but for my siblings. I started documenting everything they told me, just in case. I wasn't sure what I was planning, but I knew I needed to keep a record. If things got worse, if I needed to take action, I wanted to have proof that this wasn't just a bunch of kids exaggerating. It was a precaution I hoped I'd never need, but it felt like the only way I could do something real for them. And then, the day came that made everything I'd been holding back snap. My brother showed up with a bruise on his face. He was trying to act tough, telling me it wasn't a big deal, that it didn't hurt that much. But I could see it in his eyes, he was scared. maybe even ashamed, like he thought he was somehow responsible. That was the moment my concern turned into something colder and sharper. This wasn't just emotional abuse anymore. This was physical. Seeing that bruise on my little brother's face, it was like something broke inside of me. I felt a wave of rage and protectiveness that I'd never felt before. I tried to keep myself calm while he talked, just nodding and listening, not wanting to scare him more. He was already dealing with enough without me falling apart in front of him. But inside, my mind was racing. This had gone beyond hurtful words or emotional distance. This was physical, and I couldn't just sit back and wait for things to magically get better. I kept my voice steady as I asked him what happened, hoping he'd feel comfortable enough to open up. He hesitated, clearly struggling with how much to say. Eventually, he told me she'd gotten upset because he didn't do his chores, right? Something about leaving streaks on the windows when he cleaned them. It was such a minor thing, the kind of thing a grown-up would usually just brush off. Maybe show him the right way to do it next time. But she'd blown up, gotten in his face, and somehow, in her anger, her hand had found its way to his cheek. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. All those times I'd convinced myself it was just a phase, that maybe her frustrations were temporary, they all sounded ridiculous now. This wasn't normal, and it wasn't going to stop on its own. After he told me everything, I hugged him tight, trying to give him the comfort he hadn't been getting at home. My mind was spinning with anger and frustration, but I knew I had to be careful. I had to do this right. If I just lost it and went over there to scream at her, I'd only make things harder for him and my stepsister. They needed protection, not a show of anger. So, I started gathering everything I could. Every message, every story, every scrap of evidence I had from my siblings. I saved it all. I took photos of his bruise, made notes of everything he told me. I even asked him if he'd be willing to talk to someone about it later. If it came to that. And he nodded. I could see in his eyes that he was ready for something to change. 2. He was tired of living in fear. And I couldn't blame him. Next, I made the hardest call of my life. I dialed Child Protective Services, feeling the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me like a boulder. I didn't want to tear my family apart, but I knew there was no other way to make sure my siblings were safe. They couldn't keep living in that house, with a father who checked out and a stepmother who turned into something unrecognizable. The person on the other end of the line listened as I laid out everything. I told them about the verbal abuse, the physical altercations, the bruises, the neglect. They asked a lot of questions, and I answered each one as best as I could, forcing myself to stay calm and focus on what needed to be done. Once I'd reported everything, they told me that an investigation would start, and they'd reach out to my siblings' other guardians, my mom and my stepsister's dad, to see what steps they could take to get them out of that house. It was both a relief and a wave of guilt washing over me. I knew I'd done the right thing, but it felt like I'd just signed a document to dismantle the life my siblings knew. I couldn't shake the fear that they'd hate me for it. Then, I called my mom. That was another hard conversation. She was shocked and horrified. And for a moment, there was just silence on the line. When she finally spoke, she thanked me for looking out for my brother and assured me that she'd do everything she could to make sure he'd be okay. She told me she'd always thought my dad was unreliable. But this was beyond anything she'd ever imagined. After my mom, I called my stepsister's father. I barely knew him, but I figured he deserved to know what was going on with his daughter. He was livid, even more so than my mom, and promised he'd take legal action if needed to keep his daughter safe. With everything in motion, I could feel the weight lifting, but a new burden took its place, the fallout. My family would never be the same. I knew I'd face backlash from my dad, my stepmom, and probably even some extended family who wouldn't understand why I went straight to the authorities instead of handling it privately. I braced myself, knowing that from here on out, I'd be walking a fine line. But no matter how hard it was going to be, I was ready for it. I didn't care if my dad never spoke to me again or if my stepmom tried to paint me as the villain. I was willing to be the bad guy if it meant my siblings could live without fear. I wasn't doing this for myself, I was doing it for them. And that thought gave me the strength I needed to keep moving forward. No matter what came next. After reporting everything, I felt like I was standing in the eye of a storm. That eerie calm where you know something's coming but have no idea how bad it'll be. It didn't take long for the chaos to hit. My phone started buzzing the day after the report was filed. My dad was first, which wasn't surprising. He was furious. I didn't answer at first, but he left a voicemail. And hearing his voice was like listening to a stranger. He was yelling, calling me a traitor, saying I'd betrayed the family. He actually said that I was blowing things out of proportion, and that I should have come to him first if there were issues. As if I hadn't tried that already. As if I hadn't given him every chance to protect his own kids. Then came my stepmom. I was still debating whether to call my dad back when her number popped up. I knew I couldn't avoid her forever, so I took a deep breath and answered. I barely got a word in before she launched into a tirade. She called me every name under the sun, said I was vindictive, claimed I'd done this just to ruin her life. Her words were laced with venom, like she truly believed I'd done this out of spite rather than out of concern for my siblings. I stayed quiet, let her rant, let her get it all out, At the end, when she finally paused, I simply told her, "I did it for them. For what you did to them." And then I hung up. But her call still lingered with me. Like a bad aftertaste I couldn't shake. The guilt started to creep in. I kept thinking, maybe if I'd done something differently, it wouldn't have come to this. But I reminded myself that my loyalty had to be with my siblings. With their safety and well-being. They were kids. They didn't deserve to live in fear or be hurt by the people who were supposed to protect them. It wasn't just my dad and stepmom who were upset. Some of my extended family got involved too. Which honestly hurt even more. My aunt, who I'd always been close to, called to tell me I was young and naive, and that I just destroyed my father's life. She said families should keep their issues within the family and that I had overstepped by going to the authorities. I tried to explain, to make her see that this wasn't just a small issue. That my brother had a bruise on his face from our stepmom's hand. That they'd both been living in an abusive environment. But she brushed it off, saying kids are resilient, that they would have gotten over it. It was a slap in the face. The people I thought would understand, the ones I believed would support me no matter what, were suddenly turning their backs on me, accusing me of overreacting and being dramatic. Every call left me feeling more isolated, like I'd lost my entire family just for trying to do the right thing. I'll admit, there were moments when I wondered if they were right, if I'd made everything worse by going to the authorities. I kept replaying everything in my mind, second-guessing my actions, but then I'd remember the look on my brother's face, the fear in his eyes as he told me about what had been going on. And I'd think about my stepsister, about how she must have been feeling just as trapped, scared to speak up, as much as it hurt to feel the weight of my family's anger. I knew I'd made the right choice. My siblings were safe now, and no amount of guilt or judgment from others could make me regret that. Still, the emotional toll was heavy. I was exhausted, constantly battling my own doubts and the accusations from my family, wondering how much more I could take. In the midst of all this, my mom became my rock. She was there for every call, every moment of doubt. She reminded me over and over that my siblings were finally safe. That I'd done the brave thing, not the easy thing. She offered to let me stay with her if I needed a break. And for the first time in years, I considered it. I felt like a kid again, craving the security and warmth of her home, away from all the hostility that had overtaken my life. Her reassurance kept me grounded, helped me push through the onslaught of negativity. But what I didn't expect was how deeply this would affect my relationship with my siblings. They weren't angry with me, in fact. They seemed relieved. My brother called me every night, just to talk, and my stepsister sent me a text thanking me, telling me she finally felt safe in her dad's house. Those small words were the lifeline I needed. Hearing from them reminded me that I wasn't alone in this, that the people I did this for understood why I did it and were grateful. Despite everything, those moments with my siblings were the silver lining. They gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, this was all worth it. I'd lost a lot in the process, my relationship with my dad, the support of some family members, but I gained something far more important, the knowledge that I protected the people who needed it most. I had been there when no one else was willing to stand up for them. And as painful as the fallout was, that thought kept me going. Looking back, I think this was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I had to redefine what family meant, who I could trust, and what kind of person I wanted to be. The fallout wasn't over. I knew there was still more to come. But I was ready to face it head on, because when it came down to it, I'd rather stand alone with a clear conscience than be surrounded by people who would ignore abuse just to keep the peace. After those intense first few days, things quieted down just a bit. The constant stream of calls finally slowed, though the weight of everyone's reactions still hung over me like a heavy cloud. My dad and stepmom had stopped reaching out altogether, which, honestly, was a bit of a relief. I couldn't stomach another round of accusations or excuses. But the silence wasn't exactly peaceful. It was more like the calm before a storm. I couldn't help but wonder if they were building up to some new tactic. Another attempt to guilt or manipulate me into regretting what I'd done. During this time, I found myself living in a sort of emotional limbo. On one hand, I was committed to my decision. I protected my siblings, which was the only thing that mattered. But on the other hand, I felt isolated, as if I was drifting in some uncharted sea, with no familiar shore in sight. My siblings, while safe now, were still in the middle of their own adjustments, and I didn't want to burden them with my feelings. I wanted to be their rock, the person they could turn to without worrying about my own emotional turmoil. My mom kept encouraging me to move forward, to try and focus on my life and let things settle as they would. Give it time, she'd say, and remember why you did this. She was right, of course. But it was hard to keep that in mind when I felt like I'd been stripped of my entire support system. My friends were there, sure, and they'd been understanding, but this kind of family crisis, it's hard to really explain that to anyone who hasn't been through it. One night, lying awake in my quiet apartment, I found myself scrolling through old family photos on my phone. Images of family gatherings, holidays, and birthdays flooded my screen. There was my dad, grinning with his arm around my stepmom, my siblings laughing as they piled into group photos, me squished somewhere in the middle of it all. Looking at those memories felt surreal now, like they belonged to another lifetime. A different family altogether. I couldn't help but wonder if I'd ever feel like part of a family again. Or if this decision would forever put me on the outside, locked out of the relationships I'd once cherished. It hurt more than I wanted to admit, but I knew there was no undoing what I'd done. And even if I could turn back time, I wouldn't change a thing. I'd stood up for my siblings, for their safety and their future. And that was something I'd never regret. Still, it felt like a hollow victory when it meant severing ties with people I'd loved. Just when I thought I'd made it through the worst of it, a letter arrived from my dad. It was handwritten, something I didn't expect from him. We'd always been more of a quick text or call family, and this letter felt like a relic from a different time. My heart pounded as I unfolded the paper, wondering if this was his last-ditch attempt to pull me back into his world. Or maybe an apology, a plea for understanding. Part of me wanted to tear it up right then, to ignore whatever he had to say. But curiosity won out. The letter was strange. It was full of thinly veiled anger, masked by polite language. He started by saying he understood why I'd felt the need to interfere, but quickly moved into a litany of grievances. He wrote about how I'd betrayed the family trust and publicly humiliated him and my stepmom. He didn't once acknowledge the abuse, didn't even mention my siblings' pain. It was all about him, about how my actions had hurt his image, his pride, his sense of control. He ended by saying he hoped I'd come to my senses one day and realize the damage I'd done. I put the letter down and sat there, staring at it. That letter was his response to everything, to the suffering of his children, to the bruises on his son's face, to the years of turmoil in our family. He couldn't see past his own ego, couldn't admit even an ounce of wrongdoing. In that moment, I felt the last remnants of guilt I'd been carrying disappear. My decision had been right, and his words only solidified that for me, this wasn't someone I could ever count on. Not for myself and certainly not for my siblings. But even as I felt a certain relief in realizing I'd done the right thing, a new wave of sadness washed over me. It was like losing him all over again, mourning the idea of the father I'd always wanted him to be, rather than the one he actually was. I tried for so long to see the best in him, to believe he could change. But that letter showed me the truth. My father was more concerned with his own image than with the well-being of his family. And nothing I could do would change that. The days after reading that letter were quieter. It was as if a weight had lifted from me. I still felt the pain of losing those familial connections, but I also felt freed from the constant burden of hoping they'd change. I'd done what I could, and I couldn't carry the responsibility for their choices anymore. My focus now had to be on moving forward, on rebuilding a sense of family with the people who truly cared for me and my siblings. As hard as it was, I started letting go. I focused on the things I could control, on building a life that felt safe and stable, not just for me but as a support system for my brother and stepsister. They were young, still adapting, still healing. I wanted to be the family they could count on, the one who would never turn a blind eye to their struggles. Slowly, a new kind of peace settled over me. I realized that family didn't have to mean people bound by blood. It could mean anyone who stood by you, anyone who valued your well-being, who loved you enough to protect you even when it was hard. My mom, my siblings, my friends, they were my family now, and I'd be there for them just as they'd been there for me. Letting go of my father, of the dream of a happy, united family, wasn't easy, but it was necessary. It was the only way to finally free myself from the weight of his expectations and live a life on my own terms. And though I knew the scars of this experience would stay with me, I also knew I was stronger for it. I'd fought for the people I loved, for the truth, and that was something no letter or accusation could ever take away from me. After that letter from my dad, I felt like a door had closed behind me, locking away a part of my past I'd been holding onto for too long. It wasn't just his words that hit me but the realization that he would never change. I couldn't wait around hoping he'd suddenly become the father I needed. He'd shown me who he was. And it was time to believe him. I knew I had to move forward, to start building a life that didn't revolve around the pain of his rejection or the memory of the family I thought I had. I had to learn to trust in the connections I did have, with my mom, my siblings, and even a few close friends who'd been there for me through this entire ordeal. In those next few weeks, I found myself reaching out more, sharing my struggles and fears with people I'd usually keep at a distance. For the first time, I allowed myself to lean on others, to admit that maybe I didn't have to carry everything alone. It felt strange at first, almost uncomfortable, like wearing a new pair of shoes that hadn't been broken in. But with every conversation, every moment of vulnerability, I felt a little lighter. My mom was my anchor through all of this. She didn't push me to open up, but she was always there when I needed to talk. Sometimes we'd go on long walks around the neighborhood, not even discussing the family drama. We'd talk about her job, the book she was reading, or some funny thing she'd seen online. Those moments helped me remember that life could be simple, that there was joy to be found even amid the mess. And in those quiet, everyday conversations, I found a new kind of connection with her, one based not just on shared pain but on genuine friendship and mutual support. Then there were my friends, the ones who hadn't let me down. I started sharing parts of my journey with them, opening up about the things I'd kept to myself for so long. I'd always been the strong one in our group, The one who listened to everyone else's problems and offered advice but rarely shared my own. Letting them see me struggle felt strange, almost embarrassing, but their responses surprised me. They didn't pity me or see me as weak, they just listened. Without judgment, without trying to fix anything. They were simply there for me. And that was exactly what I needed. One night, I was sitting in my apartment, scrolling through old photos on my phone, when a thought struck me. Family, as I'd once defined it, was gone, but maybe I'd been too focused on the people who weren't there for me. Maybe it was time to focus on the people who were. I'd been building a new family all along without realizing it. One made up of people who genuinely cared. Who accepted me with all my flaws. Who didn't need me to pretend to be someone I wasn't. Slowly, I started letting go of the guilt that had weighed me down since this whole ordeal began. I'd done everything I could for my siblings. And I'd been there for them when they needed me most. I protected them when no one else would. Even if it meant making painful decisions and facing backlash from people I once thought would understand. I couldn't keep questioning myself or wondering if I should have handled things differently. The reality was that I'd stepped up. And that was something to be proud of. As the days passed, I felt myself becoming more confident in my choices. I stopped checking my phone, waiting for some text from my dad or stepmom that would miraculously make things right. I knew now that those messages would never come. And I was okay with that. I was moving forward, and they were part of a chapter I'd finished reading. I was ready to write new pages. To focus on my own life and the people who were truly there for me. I poured my energy into rebuilding myself, focusing on my work and my hobbies, spending more time with my siblings whenever I could, with my brother and stepsister now living with our mom and their dad. I found myself taking on a different role in their lives. I wasn't just their older brother anymore, I was someone they looked up to. Someone they trusted. I wanted to be the kind of person they'd feel safe turning to. The kind of role model I'd always wanted in my own life. It wasn't easy, but I took pride in showing up for them. Whether it was helping with homework over FaceTime, giving advice about school, or just chatting about their favorite movies and games. In those small moments, I felt like I was helping them build a foundation they could rely on. Something stable and secure in a world that had felt so unstable for so long. One weekend, I took them on a little day trip to a nearby park. We spent hours hiking, exploring, laughing at silly jokes, and just being together. Seeing them so happy, so carefree, reminded me why I'd done everything I had. They deserved this. A life free from fear and chaos. A life where they could just be kids. And I deserved to be part of that. To feel like I was making a difference in their lives. For the first time in months, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Letting go of the past wasn't easy. And some days were harder than others. There were still moments when I'd feel that familiar pang of loss. The ache of wishing things could have been different with my dad and stepmom. But those feelings didn't control me anymore. They were just part of my story. Part of the journey that had brought me to where I was. In time, I realized that maybe this was what family really meant, not just shared blood or history but shared values. Shared support, and a commitment to each other's well-being. Family could be the people who showed up for you, who lifted you up when you were down, who made you feel safe even when the world seemed anything but. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough for me. As I sat with my siblings, watching the sun dip below the horizon and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I'd done what I could, and I was ready to move forward. To embrace this new chapter of my life with open arms. As I watched the sunset with my siblings, a quiet sense of peace settled over me. It was one of those moments that feels heavy with meaning, like life itself had paused to let me catch my breath. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be without its bumps, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was actually moving forward, not just surviving. I was ready to leave the past behind, even if it meant doing so with a few scars. Over the next few weeks, I focused on building a life that truly felt like mine. I took up new hobbies, some I'd always wanted to try but had put off. I spent hours hiking on weekends, just breathing in the fresh air and feeling the freedom of being surrounded by trees and silence. There was something about nature that made everything feel simpler, like all the chaos faded away among the rustling leaves. I started reading more, too, not just the usual stuff, but novels, self-help books, and memoirs that reminded me of the strength that people find in the face of hardship. I'd sit by the window in the early mornings, letting the words sink in, hoping some of that resilience would rub off on me. It was like I was finally giving myself the space to grow. To figure out who I was outside of the tangled web of family drama and conflict. And as I did, I found parts of myself that I didn't know were there, parts that had been hiding. Buried beneath the weight of everything I'd been carrying. But the real transformation was in how I began to redefine family. It wasn't that I was rewriting history or erasing my parents from my life. It was more that I was shifting my focus. I wasn't putting all my energy into winning their approval or hoping they'd change. Instead, I poured myself into the relationships that truly mattered, the ones that brought light into my life rather than darkness. My siblings became central to that. Every time I saw them smile, every time we shared a silly inside joke or went on another little adventure, I felt the warmth of real connection. I wasn't just their older brother, I was someone who was making an impact. Someone they could trust and lean on. I knew that our bond was something no one could ever take away from us. No matter what happened with our parents. And then, there were my friends. I started inviting them over more. Letting them into my world in a way I'd never done before. I shared parts of my story. Not because I needed their sympathy, but because I wanted them to understand me better. I realized that I didn't have to go through things alone. They'd been waiting for me to let them in. Opening up like that felt vulnerable. Yes, but it was also incredibly freeing. For so long, I'd kept my struggles to myself, thinking it was a burden no one else should carry. But my friends showed me that I didn't have to bear it all alone. They were there for the tough stuff, too, not just the good times. The biggest shift, though, was in how I thought about my own future. For so long, I'd felt trapped in a cycle of family dysfunction, like my life was somehow fated to follow a certain path. But now, I could see that I had choices. I had control over the kind of life I wanted to build. The kind of relationships I wanted to nurture. I wasn't bound to repeat the mistakes of the past. I was free to create something different. Something better. One evening, I sat down and wrote a list of the things I wanted to accomplish. Both big and small. Some of them were practical goals, like building a savings account, advancing in my career, or taking a solo trip to a place I'd always dreamed of visiting. But others were more personal, like surround myself with people who make me feel valued, and create a home filled with warmth and kindness. I wanted to look back on my life one day and feel proud of the family I'd chosen. The one I'd built with love and intention. This new perspective didn't mean I was suddenly immune to pain or loss. There were still days when I felt the sting of my father's absence. The hollow ache of the family I'd once imagined. But those feelings didn't control me anymore. They were like shadows that passed over me. Reminders of where I'd been but not of where I was headed. Every time I spoke with my brother and stepsister, I reminded myself of the good I'd done, of the way I'd stood up for them when no one else would. I reminded myself that I'd chosen the hard path not because it was easy but because it was right. I'd broken a toxic cycle. And that mattered. I knew that my siblings were growing up in a safer, healthier environment because of the choices I'd made. That knowledge was like an anchor, keeping me grounded even when doubts crept in. Eventually, I reached a point where I could look back on everything without anger. I wasn't excusing what had happened or forgetting the harm that had been done. But I was making peace with it. I realized that forgiveness didn't mean letting my parents back into my life. It simply meant releasing the hold their actions had over me. I was choosing to let go. Not for them, but for me. And in that choice, I found freedom. After a while, I started to feel the quiet freedom that came with truly letting go. You know, it's funny, people always say, forgive and forget, as if it's something you just wake up and decide to do one morning. But for me, it wasn't like that. Letting go wasn't a single moment. It was a process, a gradual shedding of layers I'd carried around for years. Some days, it felt light, almost like a relief, while other days, it felt like I was ripping off a band-aid that had been stuck for far too long. I stopped obsessing over the what-ifs, the whys, the hows, the questions that used to haunt me, like why my dad could never see me for who I was or why my stepmom had changed so drastically, began to lose their hold. The truth is, I'd probably never get the answers I wanted, and maybe that was okay. Holding on to the need for closure was just keeping me trapped. Reliving every slight and bruise as if they just happened yesterday. I realized that by letting go, I wasn't giving them a free pass. I was giving myself the space to finally breathe. One night, as I was sitting alone on my porch with a cup of coffee, the weight of it all just kind of hit me. Not in a heavy way, though, it was actually more like a release. I felt this lightness, almost a sense of contentment, as I accepted that some parts of my story would never have neat endings. And for the first time, that didn't scare me. I could rewrite my own story without needing everyone else's pages to line up perfectly. I started thinking about what I wanted out of life. Really wanted, not just the usual goals of a career, a house, maybe a dog, but the things that made life feel whole. I wanted stability and warmth. The kind of life where I didn't have to second guess whether the people around me had my back. I wanted a family, not necessarily the kind I'd been born into, but one I could choose. One I could build from scratch if I had to. And in that moment, I felt this powerful conviction that I could actually make it happen. It was like I'd been standing at the edge of a cliff for so long. Afraid to jump, afraid of what lay below. But now, I felt ready to step back, turn around, and walk a different path altogether. I didn't need to keep staring down at the darkness below. I could focus on the road ahead and actually feel excited about what was waiting there. Around this time, my siblings were settling into their new routines, and I was seeing real changes in them. They were happier, lighter, more at ease. Knowing I'd helped create that for them gave me a sense of purpose I'd never felt before. They were like little mirrors, reflecting back the love and protection I tried so hard to give. And that was enough for me. As for my parents, I chose to keep my distance. It wasn't a bitter or angry choice, it was just a decision grounded in self-preservation. I knew that going back would only drag me down again, and I was finally in a place where I could feel good about moving forward without them. I didn't need to prove myself to them anymore. Their opinions, their approval, all the things I'd once craved, just didn't matter like they used to. I had built a life without them, and that life was worth protecting. The odd part was how others responded. Some people, mostly family friends or distant relatives, still tried to guilt me into reaching out, patching things up. Family is family, they'd say, as if that was supposed to fix everything. But they didn't know what it was like. They hadn't lived through the quiet toxicity, the manipulation, the constant feeling of never being enough. I'd learned that sometimes, the healthiest thing you can do is step away, and no amount of well-meaning advice was going to change that. It took me a long time to realize that I didn't have to carry the weight of their expectations anymore. I could live by my own standards, create my own rules for what family meant. I didn't have to live with guilt, didn't have to let the past define me. I was finally allowing myself to be free, to imagine a life filled with peace instead of turmoil, with joy instead of resentment. And in that realization, I found a strength I didn't know I had. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving, building a life filled with the kind of love, respect, and stability that I'd always wanted. It was a quiet, unspoken freedom, but it was everything I needed. Now, as I sit here, reflecting on everything, I feel like I'm finally standing on solid ground. It's funny, really, I spent so long trying to steady myself in a world that was never going to be stable. All that energy, all those years, wasted on people who couldn't see beyond themselves. And now, here I am, building a life that's finally my own. No more bending over backward to please anyone. No more tiptoeing around emotions that weren't mine to fix. Just me, living, breathing, feeling like myself for the first time in a long, long time. It hasn't been easy, not by a long shot. Letting go of family, the people you're supposed to be closest to, is like losing a part of yourself. It's grief, mixed with relief, tinged with a kind of strange freedom that's hard to explain unless you've been through it. Some days, I still feel that pang. Like maybe I could have done something differently. Maybe I could have been more patient, more understanding, but deep down, I know that's just the old patterns talking. It's the old me, the one who thought it was her job to fix everything. And she's gone now. I'm moving forward with a clearer idea of what I want. I know the kind of people I want to surround myself with, people who lift me up, who support me without conditions or strings attached. I'm learning that I can create my own family, one built on trust, respect, and mutual care. It's a comforting thought, knowing I'm not tied to my past, that I don't have to settle for the family I was born into. I can build a new one, slowly, with people who are worthy of the love I have to give. And there's a strength in me now that wasn't there before. I'm more resilient, more self-assured. I don't second-guess myself as much. I know my own worth. I've walked through hell, and I'm still here, still standing, maybe a little scarred, but stronger than ever. I've realized that I don't need anyone else's approval to feel whole. I don't need validation from people who can't see past their own insecurities. I've become my own anchor, my own source of stability. And that's a power no one can take away from me. I'm grateful for the friends and the few family members who've been there through all of this. Who've seen the worst and still choose to stay. They remind me of the good in people, the kindness that exists if you're willing to open up to it. They've shown me that love doesn't have to hurt, that relationships don't have to come with conditions. And for the first time, I'm starting to believe that maybe I do deserve that kind of love. The kind that's simple, supportive, and true. Looking back, I see everything that happened as part of my journey. A tough, painful chapter that led me here. Would I change it if I could? Maybe, but I know it shaped me into who I am today. It taught me resilience, showed me the depths of my own strength, and pushed me to build a life on my own terms. It forced me to confront what I want, what I need, and what I will never settle for again. So here I am, ready to step forward, no longer weighed down by the past. I don't know exactly where this path will lead, but for the first time, I'm excited to find out. I'm building a future that's mine, filled with the kind of peace and love I've always wanted. And if that means leaving some people behind, so be it. My life is mine to live, and I intend to live it fully, freely, and with a heart that's finally, truly my own.